Hi, everybody. This is Ms. Brazil, and I'm going to be reading the next chapter of Artemis Fowl for you. I just want to remind you that it's really important that you follow along while I'm reading. This is how we're going to be building up our fluency, our vocabulary, and our comprehension skills. I'm going to really simplify the lessons for you this week because it seems like a lot of you are probably really overwhelmed with your summit work, and I totally understand that. But it is still important for us to work on our reading skills. So, all you're going to be doing for me this week is listening and following along while I read to you Artemis Fowl. And then we're going to have a discussion question posted. And all you have to do is respond with a couple of sentences, show me that you are participating, and you're done for the week. Okay? So once again, you guys are just going to be following along. I'm going to be reading. This is our new chapter in Artemis Fowl. Chapter 4, Abduction. Artemis's main problem was one of location, how to locate a leprechaun. This was one sly bunch of fairies, hanging around for God knows how many millennia, and still not one photo, not one frame of video, not even a Loch Ness type hoax. They weren't exactly a sociable group, and they were smart, too. No one had ever got his hands on fairy gold, but no one had ever had access to the book either, and puzzles were so simple when you had the key. Artemis had summoned the butlers to his study, and spoke to them now from behind a mini lectern. There are certain rituals every fairy must complete to renew his magic, explained Artemis. Butler and Juliet nodded, as though this were a normal briefing. Artemis flicked through his hard copy of the book and selected a passage. From the earth thine power flows, given through courtesy, so thanks are owed. Pluck thou the magic seed, where full moon, ancient oak, and twisted water meet, and bury it far from where it was found, so return your gift into the ground. Artemis closed the text. Do you see? Butler and Juliet kept nodding, while still looking thoroughly mystified. Artemis sighed. The leprechaun is bound by certain rituals, very specific rituals, I might add. We can use them to track one down. Juliet raised a hand, even though she herself was 4 years Artemis's senior. Yes? Okay, starting at the top. Well, the thing is, Artemis, she said hesitantly, twisting a strand of blonde hair in a way that several of the local louts considered extremely attractive. The bit about leprechauns. Artemis frowned. It was a bad sign. Your point, Juliet? Well, leprechauns. You know they're not real, don't you? Butler winced. It was his fault, really. He never got around to filling in his sister on the mission parameters. Artemis scowled reprovingly at him. Butler hasn't already talked to you about this? No, was he supposed to? Yes, he certainly was. Perhaps he thought you'd laugh at him. Butler squirmed. That was exactly what he thought. Juliet was the only person alive who laughed at him with embarrassing regularity. Most other people did it once. Just once. Artemis cleared his throat. Let us proceed under the assumption that the fairy folk do exist and that I am not a gibbering moron. Butler nodded weakly. Juliet was unconvinced. Very well. Now, as I was saying, the people have to fulfill a specific ritual to renew their powers. According to my interpretation, they must pick a seed from an ancient oak tree by the bend in a river, and they must do this during the full moon. The light began to dawn in Butler's eyes. So all we have to do is run a cross-reference through the weather satellites, which I already have. Believe it or not, there aren't that many ancient oaks left, if you take ancient to be 100 years plus. When you factor in the river bend and full moon, there are precisely 129 sites to be surveyed in this country. Butler grinned. Stake out. Now the master was speaking his language. There are preparations to be made for our guest's arrival, said Artemis. handing a typewritten sheet of A4 to Juliet. "These alterations must be made to the cellar. See to it, Juliet." To the letter. "Yes, Artie." Artemis frowned, but only slightly. For reasons that he couldn't quite fathom, he didn't mind terribly when Juliet called him by the pet name his mother had for him. Butler scratched his chin thoughtfully. Artemis noticed the gesture. "Query?" "Well, Artemis, the sprite in Ho Chi Minh City." Artemis nodded. "I know. Why didn't we simply abduct her?" "Yes, sir." According to Chi Lun's Almanac of the People, a 7th century manuscript recovered from the lost city of Shamo, once a fairy has taken spirits with the mud people. That's us, by the way. They are forever dead to their brothers and sisters. So there was no guarantee that that particular fairy was worth even an ounce of gold. No, my old friend, we need fresh blood. All clear? Butler nodded. Good. Now there are several items you will need to procure for our moonlight jaunts. Butler scanned the sheet. Basic field equipment, a few eyebrow razors, nothing too puzzling until... Sunglasses? At night? When Artemis smiled as he did now, one almost expected vampire fangs to sprout from his gums. Yes, Butler, sunglasses. Trust me. And Butler did, implicitly. Holly activated the thermal coil in her suit and climbed to 4,000 meters. The hummingbird wings were top of the range. The battery readout showed 4 red bars, more than enough for a quick jaunt through mainland Europe and across the British Isles. Of course, the regulations said always travel over water if possible, but Holly could never resist knocking the snow cap from the highest Alp on her way past. The suit protected Holly from the worst of the elements, but she could still feel the chill sinking into her bones. The moon seemed huge from this altitude, the crater on its surface easily distinguishable. Tonight it was a perfect sphere, a magical full moon. Immigration would have their hands full, as thousands of surface-sick fairies were drawn irresistibly overground. A large percentage would make it, possibly causing mayhem in the revelry. The Earth's mantle was riddled with illegal tunnels, and it was impossible to police them all. Holly followed the Italian coast up to Monaco, and from there across the Alps to France. She loved flying. All fairies did. According to the book, they had once been equipped with wings of their own, but evolution had stripped them of this power. All but the sprites. One school of thought believed that the people were descended from airborne dinosaurs, possibly pterodactyls. Much of the upper body skeletal structure was the same. The theory would certainly explain the tiny nub of bone on each shoulder blade. Holly toyed with the idea of visiting Disneyland Paris. The LEP had several undercover operatives stationed there, most of them working in the Snow White exhibit. It was one of the few places on Earth that the people could pass unnoticed. But if some tourist got a photo of her and it ended up on the internet, Root would have her badge for sure. With a sigh of regret, she passed over the shower of multicolored fireworks below. Once over the channel, Holly flew low, skipping over the white-crested waves. She called out to the dolphins, and they rose to the surface, leaping from the water to match her pace. She could see the pollution in them, bleaching their skin white and causing red sores on their backs. And although she smiled, her heart was breaking. Mud people had a lot to answer for. Finally, the coast loomed ahead of her, the old country. Riu, the land where time began, the most magical place on the planet. It was here, 10,000 years ago, that the ancient fairy race, the Danan, had battled against the demon Fomerians, carving the famous Giant's Causeway with the strength of their magical blasts. It was here that Leah Fowl stood, the rock at the center of the universe, where the fairy kings and later the human Ard Ri were crowned. And it was also here, unfortunately, that the Mud People were most in tune with magic, which resulted in a far higher people sighting rate than you got anywhere else on the planet. Thankfully, the rest of the world assumed that the Irish were crazy, a theory that the Irish themselves did nothing to debunk. They had somehow got it into their heads that each fairy lugged around a pot of gold with them wherever they went. While it was true that LEP had a ransom fund, because of its officers' high-risk occupation, no human had ever taken a chunk of it yet. This didn't stop the Irish population in general from skulking around rainbows, hoping to win the supernatural lottery. But, in spite of all that, if there was one race the people felt an affinity for, it was the Irish. Perhaps it was their eccentricity, perhaps their dedication to the Craig, as they called it. And if the people were actually related to humans, as another theory had it, odds on it was the Emerald Isle was where it started. Holly punched up a map on her wrist locator and set it to sweep for magical hotspots. The best site would obviously be Tara, near the Leah Fail, but on a night like tonight, every traditionalist fairy with an overgrown pass would be dancing around the holy scene. So best to give it a miss. There was a secondary site not far from here, just off the southeast coast. Easy access from the air, but remote and desolate for land-bound humans. Holly reined in the throttle and descended to 80 meters. She skipped over a bristling evergreen forest, emerging in a moonlit meadow. A silver strand of river bisected the field, and there, nestling in the fold of a meander loop, was the proud oak. Holly checked her locator for life forms. Once she judged the cow 2 fields over not to be a threat. She cut her engines and glided to the foot of the mighty tree. 4 months of stakeout. Even Butler, the consummate professional, was beginning to dread the long nights of damp and insect bites. Thankfully, the moon was not full every night. It was always the same. They would crouch in their foil-lined hide in complete silence, Butler repeatedly checking his equipment, while Artemis stared unblinking through the eye of the scope. At times like these, nature seemed deafening in their confined space. Butler longed to whistle, to make conversation, anything to break the unnatural silence. But Artemis's concentration was absolute. He would brook no interference or lapse of focus. This was business. Tonight they were in the southeast, the most inaccessible site yet. Butler had been forced to make 3 trips to the Jeep in order to hump the equipment across a stile, a bog, and 2 fields. His boots and trousers were ruined, and now he would have to sit in the hide with ditch water soaking into the seat of his trousers. Artemis had somehow contrived to remain spotless. I'm going to end this video right here because I only have about a minute left on this application, so you're going to need to go to the second video of the week in which I will finish this chapter of Artemis Fowl.